So, if we think about ways that people have understood the environment, historically there's a whole body of traditional knowledge that Indigenous and local people use to understand their environment, predict changes, relate changes in climate patterns to changes in animal and plant behaviour, for example. And here's a picture that Richard took of Aboriginal women burning country in the Northern Territory. Knowledge that relied upon a very detailed understanding of the environment in which they live. With the rise of science in the 19th century, we had the rise of very discipline-focused understanding of the environment. We understood little bits of it, like water quality. This is a Brazilian scientist assessing whether the plantation trees in the background are having an adverse impact on water quality. So we understood better the individual components of the environment, but not necessarily how they fitted together. It wasn't until the 1980s, really, when we had a focus on what we now call sustainability, that people began to think about and began to develop conceptual frameworks for thinking about how these different components of the environment might interact and together shape our future. So that's where the concept of sustainability arose. I imagine that you're already familiar with this. I just want to put a few points to you to give you a bit of a historical context. It's generally thought that the concept of sustainability began to be talked about internationally in the 1970s and 1980s. So you can look at the World Conservation Strategy from 1980 that talked about the unsustainable trajectory of development and talked about the need to balance conservation and development. The concept was popularised in 1987 in the report called Our Common Future by the World Commission on Environment and Development. It's a book that you can still access, and if you haven't read Our Common Future, it's worth reading now as it was 30 years ago. And that report of an international commission introduced the terminology for sustainability that's still widely used, talked about sustainable development, sustainability being meeting the needs of the current generation without prejudicing the needs of future generations. And we found other ways of articulating this concept. Here's a quote from an international strategy called Caring for the Earth, another version in 1990 of the original 1980 World Conservation Strategy. Often you'll now see sustainability represented in these terms, these intersecting Venn diagrams. This concept was introduced by a British economist, Ed Barbier, in 1987, and he argued that sustainability had three essential dimensions: the environmental, the economic, and the social. And that sustainable, for development, for activities to be sustainable, they had to satisfy each of those criteria simultaneously, hence the conceptual intersection of those Venn diagrams. He also acknowledged that that concept was dynamic, that it changed over time, and so there's a temporal dimension to our understanding of sustainability. That concept's proved, that representation of sustainability has proved pretty durable, and so you can look at the ACT government website. I've given you the website on the slide there, and you can see the same representation being used with slightly different language, perhaps more contemporary language, people, place and prosperity, to represent the way we understand, or the way that the ACT government understands sustainability. But as many commentators have argued, it's a very elegant concept to think about sustainability in these conceptual terms. How do we actually put our finger on it? How do we measure and monitor sustainability in a way that enables us to answer the question that I asked you at the beginning? Are things getting better or are they getting worse? And part of the challenge there is the point made by Jeremy Carey-Reid and his co-authors in a book in 1993 about sustainability, where they talked about it being a journey rather than a harbour. Sustainability, they argued, is not some state that we achieve, rather it's a constant challenge to improve the balance between the way we use resources and the way we care for the environment. So they use this metaphor of a voyage rather than a harbour, which I think is quite powerful.
So
hello.
How different would this be from the triple bottom line? Is this like the same thing?
From the triple bottom line?
Yeah. Is there like
thanks for the cue, okay? Here's a picture of the triple bottom line. This is from the Australian Conservation Foundation Sustainability Report in 2002-3, as you can see. And it's the play on the concept that still made it through the filters on the internet of the triple bottom line. So the question that's being asked is that business has tended to talk about this concept of three intersecting dimensions of sustainability in terms of the triple bottom line. That is, that the business talks about the bottom line in terms of economic performance, but it acknowledges that its environmental performance and its social licence to operate are important considerations. So if you read business publications about sustainability, you'll almost invariably read about the triple bottom line. And so here's the Conservation Foundation making a bit of a joke about the way that business talks about the triple bottom line. Does that answer the question? It's the same thing, different picture. So, I haven't yet talked about how we might assess sustainability, but if we think about the flip side, it's often pretty clear when we're stuffing up. It's often pretty clear when we're on an unsustainable trajectory. And we've got plenty of evidence for that in the Australian landscape. You'd be aware, I'm sure, that the Australian landscape is naturally saline, and that 220 years of European settlement and clearing of deep-rooted native vegetation has allowed the saline water table to rise, exacerbating that problem with enormous challenges for the sustainability of Australian agriculture and land use systems. And I'm fond of using Einstein's quote about solving problems, which I've written out for you here at the bottom of the picture. He wasn't talking about sustainability, he wasn't talking about land degradation in Australia, but he was talking about a more generic issue, that the way that your generation has to think about solving the problems that my generation and the generations before me have created, you've got to start thinking differently about those solutions to the way that we thought about them. Otherwise, we're likely to repeat the sorts of problems that we created. So, signs of unsustainability, which might be hitting you between the eyes in the case of salinity in Australia, is one way that we might recognise sustainability. The problem with that is what? Is that a good way of thinking about addressing sustainability? Too late, isn't it? Usually way too late to do something about it. So we've had instead a range of indicators of well-being, environmental well-being and human well-being began to be developed in a way to try to address this issue of understanding whether the pattern of environmental use and development that we're engaged on is likely to be sustainable or not. And I've listed three international indicators and programs here. The United Nations Human Development Index, which is an index that assesses, that ranks countries from best to worst in terms of a whole collection of indicators of human well-being, health, education, access to services, life expectancy, those sorts of things. The World Bank is the leading international development agency. It provides funding to assist poorer countries capitalise on their natural and human capital, and so it's a microcosm of the way that the world thinks about development. It publishes a Sustainable Development Report each year. And at the turn of the century, around the turn of the century, there was a very large-scale effort called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which tried to review the state of the world, essentially in significant detail, and report on what that meant for our options for the future. So if you're not familiar with any of those three approaches, I'd suggest that you take some time to look at them.